Blood pooling on a concrete porch tells a very specific, undeniable story, one of sudden violence, a physical struggle, and desperate panic. Why would a violent intruder, someone willing to aggressively spill blood outside in the dark of night, a solitary figure slowly emerged from the darkness at the edge of the residential property line? It was absolutely not the erratic, highly nervous movement of a desperate thief simply looking for an easy, unlocked window to exploit. The figure moved with a chilling, incredibly deliberate, and highly tactical purpose. As the unknown suspect stepped closer to the infrared glow of the primary camera, the horrifying details of the looming threat finally came into sharp, undeniable focus. The individual was clearly an adult male, standing approximately 5 feet and 9 inches tall, possessing a distinctly average, entirely unremarkable physical build. But it was his terrifying level of tactical preparation that immediately sent a cold shockwave through the seasoned investigative team. The face of the man was completely and intentionally concealed behind a heavy, dark mask, entirely erasing any identifiable facial features or basic demographic markers. Secured firmly to his side, distinctly visible in the harsh security lighting, was a heavily strapped, professionally holstered handgun. He was fully armed, completely concealed, and totally prepared to deploy immediate lethal force if he encountered absolutely any unexpected physical resistance. Most chillingly, strapped tightly to his back was a very specific dark-colored utility backpack. Take such painstaking, deliberate care to keep the inside of the home of an 84-year-old woman absolutely flawless. Later, forensic analysis of the footage would quickly identify this exact bag as a proprietary, mass-produced model sold almost exclusively at Walmart retail locations. He did not carry a heavy steel crowbar, and he did not hold a large duffel bag traditionally designed for stealing bulky electronic equipment or heavy residential safes. He carried only a small, tightly secured backpack, perfectly sized to hold plastic zip ties, heavy industrial duct tape, powerful chemical sedatives, or specialized mechanical tools specifically designed for sudden human restraint. The federal investigators watched in absolute horrified silence as the masked, heavily armed man methodically approached the exterior walls of the Guthrie residence. He did not immediately smash a fragile glass door or violently attempt to kick in a reinforced wooden frame. Instead, the silent footage definitively captured him calmly and expertly reaching up toward the expensive external surveillance hardware, deliberately attempting to physically disable, cover, or permanently blind the front-facing security cameras before smoothly executing the primary violent phase of his operation. This was the exact, undeniable moment the entire foundational theory of the criminal case violently shifted. This singular, chilling contradiction is the exact thread that unravels one of the most perplexing and heavily scrutinized ongoing investigations in recent American history. This concrete visual evidence completely shattered absolutely any lingering hope that this was just a random tragic accident or a chaotic crime of desperate financial opportunity. A common burglar intentionally brings heavy tools to break into a locked metal safe. A professional kidnapper intentionally brings specialized tools to physically break a human being. The armed man on the screen had completely bypassed the incredibly valuable assets inside the house, leaving the pristine home completely untouched, because his sole premeditated target was the fragile 84-year-old woman sleeping inside. As you deeply analyze the deliberate, methodical movements of the masked suspect on your screen right now, ask yourself a highly critical question. Do you see the erratic, fearful body language of a common neighborhood thief frantically looking for a quick financial score? Or do you instantly recognize the terrifying, calculated discipline of a dangerous individual who has meticulously rehearsed this exact abduction scenario dozens of times before actually striking in the dark? The horrifying confirmation of a highly coordinated, armed abduction immediately elevated the crisis from a localized missing persons inquiry into a massive federal manhunt. The absolute highest priority for detectives was establishing a clean, undeniable circle of suspicion. It is a complex case where the physical evidence loudly points in one direction. In almost every domestic disappearance case, historical probability demands that law enforcement heavily scrutinize the immediate family members first, exhaustively analyzing their personal alibis, hidden financial motives, and emotional stability before looking outward at dangerous strangers. Pima County Sheriff Chris Nanos took direct, commanding control of the rapidly expanding, highly sensitive investigation, completely understanding the intense national media scrutiny that would inevitably surround the grieving family of a prominent television journalist. Sheriff Nanos made a highly unusual and deeply strategic public declaration very early in the chaotic process. He confidently stepped in front of the flashing press microphones and unequivocally cleared the immediate family members of absolutely any criminal involvement in the violent disappearance. He publicly stated that the relatives, specifically including the daughter and the son-in-law who had safely dropped Nancy off mere hours before the brutal attack, were completely cooperative, entirely devastated, and conclusively ruled out as viable suspects. This incredibly rare, highly expedited public exoneration served a very specific, crucial, tactical purpose for the strained investigative team. It immediately shut down the rampant, highly distracting media speculation that always maliciously plagues high-profile criminal cases, while the behavioral evidence points towards something far more calculated, deeply personal, and undeniably sinister, allowing specialized detectives to violently pivot absolutely all of their combined federal resources toward tracking the heavily armed, masked phantom captured on the perimeter security cameras. With the entire family officially removed from the expansive suspect board, elite forensic teams rapidly descended upon the Catalina Foothills property with an obsessive, incredibly microscopic focus. If the pristine interior of the sprawling house was completely immaculate and devoid of any useful forensic evidence, they desperately had to extract the hidden truth from the bloody, disorganized chaos left outside in the freezing cold. Every single blade of manicured grass, every square inch of stained concrete, and every shadowy corner of the assumed escape route was meticulously documented and rigorously processed. It was exactly during this exhaustive, millimeter by millimeter grid search of the surrounding exterior property that diligent investigators finally stumbled upon a massive, potentially case-breaking piece of physical evidence, discarded carelessly near the immediate perimeter of the violent crime scene, abandoned in the dark dirt, as the masked suspect frantically fled with the 84-year-old victim was a single dark-colored glove. It was a staggering, almost unbelievable, unforced operational error by an unknown individual who had otherwise demonstrated incredibly terrifying methodical tactical discipline on the surveillance video. The vital glove was immediately bagged in sterile evidence paper, heavily secured in the strict legal chain of custody. Baffling stalemates in high-stakes criminal investigations are very often broken by a single, seemingly insignificant detail hidden in plain sight, and rapidly rushed to the state crime laboratory under the highest possible emergency priority status. Expert forensic technicians immediately began the incredibly delicate, highly time-consuming scientific process of carefully swabbing the dark inner lining of the discarded fabric, desperately hunting for microscopic dead skin cells, lingering dried sweat, or absolutely any trace amounts of human biological material that the masked suspect might have accidentally left behind in the chaotic heat of the physical struggle. A confirmed DNA profile successfully extracted from that single glove would immediately provide desperate investigators with the ultimate biological weapon. It could be instantly run through massive national criminal databases, potentially unmasking the terrifying predator in a matter of mere hours if he had absolutely any prior felony convictions securely logged on his permanent record. As the agonizing, breathless wait for the official laboratory DNA results began to paralyze the tense command center, exhausted detectives continued to ruthlessly canvass the entire sprawling neighborhood, desperately hunting for the specific dark Walmart backpack or the holstered weapon clearly seen in the grainy video. If you notice absolutely anything unusual as we meticulously examine the official timeline and the recovered security footage today, the immense pressure from the massive national media apparatus was escalating exponentially by the hour, heavily fueled by the incredibly high-profile connections of the victim. Every passing minute was a terrifying statistical death sentence for a fragile 84-year-old woman who desperately required a specialized cardiac pacemaker and heavy daily prescription medication just to physically survive. The entire complex investigation felt painfully suspended in a terrifying, suffocating limbo, entirely dependent on the slow, incredibly methodical science of microscopic genetic extraction. But just as exhausted detectives grimly braced themselves for an incredibly long forensic waiting game, the entire established trajectory of the federal investigation was violently hijacked by a completely new, deeply disturbing development. Without absolutely any prior warning, local media outlets and established law enforcement agencies suddenly began receiving highly specific, deeply terrifying written communications. The case was no longer just a silent, bloody mystery hidden in the remote Arizona desert. The ruthless orchestrators of the violent abduction had finally decided to aggressively step out of the deep shadows and make their terrifying demands fully known to the world. Or if your own analytical instincts lead you down a completely different path than the veteran federal criminal profilers, leave your detailed observations below. The deeply unsettling arrival of detailed typed ransom notes aggressively thrust the stalling case into an entirely new phase, introducing a complex psychological warfare element that completely shattered existing behavioral profiles and forcefully compelled veteran federal agents to confront an entirely different, incredibly dangerous breed of criminal motivation. The arrival of written demands usually provides a tangible direction in an abduction investigation. It shifts the dynamic from a blind search to a dark negotiation. According to multiple media sources, detailed communications claiming responsibility and demanding a massive financial payout began filtering into newsrooms and law enforcement channels. For a brief moment, this development seemed to offer a desperate glimmer of hope. A financial demand implies the victim is a valuable commodity, and commodities are typically kept alive to ensure a successful transaction. But as the behavioral analysis unit began dissecting the language and the timing of these alleged messages, a profound and terrifying paranoia began to infect the command center. The fundamental rule of any ransom negotiation is the establishment of biological reality. And please remember to step into the permanent archive of Seth Crime Stories by subscribing to the channel right now. The captors must undeniably prove that their high-value target is currently breathing, conscious, and physically capable of being returned. This is universally known as proof of life. Yet, as the strict deadlines dictated within the type pages rapidly approached and then agonizingly expired, the anonymous senders provided absolutely nothing. There was no recent photograph holding a current newspaper. There was no brief, forced audio recording playing over a secure line. There was only an oppressive, deafening silence following the initial financial threats. This glaring omission completely derailed the conventional kidnapping protocol. When an extortionist refuses to verify the condition of their captive, seasoned investigators are forced to entertain a much darker hypothesis. They must consider that the financial demands are nothing more than a carefully constructed illusion. A staged extortion letter is a classic psychological countermeasure deployed by sophisticated predators to deliberately waste the most critical resource in any missing persons investigation, so we can continue dissecting the darkest, most complex forensic files together every single week, which is time. By forcing federal agents to chase phantom bank accounts, trace encrypted digital communications, and prepare complex undercover financial drops, the true orchestrators buy themselves days of unhindered mobility. The investigators staring at these unverified demands begin to realize they might be playing a rigged game. If the primary objective was never actually monetary gain, then the entire profile of the faceless adversary had to be completely rewritten. Why would someone execute an incredibly risky, highly complex physical extraction of a well-known public figure relative, completely ignore the lucrative assets scattered throughout the residence, and then send hollow financial threats that they never intended to follow through on? The answer to that specific question is terrifying because it suggests a level of malice that cannot be negotiated with using cash. It suggests an operation driven by deep-seated personal animosity or a twisted desire to inflict maximum psychological devastation on a highly visible target. The authorities were no longer just looking for an opportunistic extortionist. They were hunting a phantom who understood exactly how to manipulate the media, redirect federal resources, and exploit the very specific protocols of a modern hostage crisis. When crime scene investigators carefully step around those dark red stains and forcefully push open a front door to truly understand the deeply fractured mind of the masked predator who meticulously orchestrated this bizarre crime scene. As the agonizing hours stretched into days, the lack of verifiable communication amplified the quiet desperation gripping the local community. The typed letters sat in sterile evidence bags, heavily scrutinized for microscopic linguistic patterns. They were just pieces of paper, serving as a cruel taunt rather than a genuine lifeline. The realization that the investigation might be chasing a deliberate deception forced the tactical teams to completely reassess their fundamental understanding of the enemy. The phantom suspect had perfectly anticipated the exact law enforcement response and built a labyrinth of misdirection. Every single hour spent chasing these unverified demands was an hour the suspect used to further secure their hidden position. The frustration within the briefing rooms was palpable as veteran detectives recognized they were being actively managed by the very individual they were desperately trying to capture. This was not just a crime. It was a highly orchestrated performance designed to humiliate the authorities and mentally break the family. Who would be capable of orchestrating such a deeply deceptive, multi-layered psychological operation while simultaneously maintaining absolute physical discipline during the initial breach of the residence? Do you think a purely financially motivated criminal would ever risk losing a massive payout by simply refusing to provide a basic photograph? We first have to understand the quiet, isolated environment they deliberately targeted and the hidden vulnerabilities they specifically chose to exploit. Or does this glaring silence suggest a much darker, fundamentally different kind of endgame? The psychological toll on the specific agents assigned to read these empty threats was immense. They were forced to maintain a stoic, professional exterior while internally battling the sickening realization that they were likely communicating with a ghost. To break through the paralyzing fog of deception and decipher the true meaning behind the staged crime scene, the task force brought in the heaviest analytical artillery available. Former Federal Bureau of Investigation special agents and renowned criminal profilers Greg Rogers and Johnny Grusing were tasked with examining the fragmented evidence. These are individuals who have spent decades staring into the darkest corners of human behavior, studying exactly how violent predators think, plan, and execute their worst impulses. They looked at the bloody concrete outside, they looked at the perfectly undisturbed living room inside, and they immediately delivered a chilling verdict that completely redefined the entire trajectory of the manhunt. They officially and categorically obliterated the lingering theory of a burglary gone wrong. Living quietly in the shadow of massive public fame creates a very specific, deeply unsettling kind of invisible vulnerability. A panicked thief, surprised by a homeowner, leaves a chaotic trail of destruction. They knock over lamps. They shatter glass. They drop stolen items in their desperate scramble to escape. The absolute perfection of the interior spaces was not a lucky coincidence. It was a definitive behavioral signature. The profilers explained that the violent struggle happened entirely outside the threshold because the predator never actually needed to go inside to find what he wanted. He waited in the deep shadows of the freezing night, perfectly anticipating his target, and struck with overwhelming force before she could securely barricade herself inside. The blood on the patio was the result of a calculated ambush, not a random collision of circumstances. With the burglary theory entirely destroyed, the profilers outlined 3 incredibly specific, deeply terrifying potential motives for this type of hyper-targeted abduction. First, they pointed toward a highly personal, deeply entrenched vendetta. This points the investigation toward someone who possessed intimate insider knowledge of the specific layout of the property and the rigid daily schedule of the resident. This could be a disgruntled former employee, a specialized maintenance contractor. For an 84-year-old woman living alone, the stark contrast between her deeply private or anyone who had previously been granted access to the private sanctuary and harbored a dangerous, quiet resentment. Second, they warned of a radical ideological motive. When a victim is directly tied to a prominent national journalist, they become a symbolic proxy. The abduction could be a violent, twisted form of political or social retaliation designed to send a chilling message to the mainstream media apparatus by striking at their most vulnerable loved ones. Finally, they detailed the possibility of a highly sophisticated next-generation extortion ring. These are not common thugs sending hollow letters. These are organized syndicates who meticulously research the financial architectures of high-net-worth families, executing precision strikes and waiting patiently in the dark before initiating a devastating, inescapable ransom demand that bypasses traditional law enforcement channels entirely. This profound psychological assessment finally answered the glaring question that had haunted the investigation from the very first morning. Increasingly fragile daily reality and the highly visible, heavily broadcasted life of her immediate family is a dangerous paradox. The house remained perfectly clean because the architectural structure was never the target. The physical structure was completely irrelevant to the mission. The masked phantom had crossed the property line with a singular, terrifying focus, treating the massive home as nothing more than an inconvenient backdrop to a highly specific human acquisition. The profilers painted a horrifying picture of a disciplined, patient predator who knew exactly who he was hunting, why he was hunting her, and precisely how to vanish without leaving a single fingerprint inside the residence. This was not a crime of opportunity. It was a masterclass in premeditated malice. The implications of these three motives required a completely different investigative approach. A personal vendetta requires digging through years of employment records and local interactions. An ideological strike requires monitoring radical online forums and extremist communications across the country. Nancy Guthrie was the mother of Savannah Guthrie, the widely recognized and celebrated co-anchor of the massive NBC News television program Today. A sophisticated extortion syndicate requires tracking international financial networks and dark web chatter. The profilers had essentially handed the detectives a map with three entirely different destinations, all of them completely terrifying, but they had also provided something invaluable, which was absolute clarity regarding the nature of the beast they were hunting. They were no longer looking for a disorganized opportunist. They were looking for a shadow who possessed the tactical patience to watch, wait, and execute a flawless extraction while leaving the physical world around the victim completely undisturbed. This clarity brought a cold, heavy reality to the command center. The realization that this was a targeted strike meant the perpetrator was likely miles away, perfectly insulated by layers of meticulous planning, long before the first local deputy ever arrived at the bloody patio. If you were sitting at the head of that briefing table, listening to these veteran behavioral analysts dissect the chilling precision of the ambush, while millions of devoted viewers saw her daughter radiating confidence on national television screens every single morning, which of those three dark paths would you dedicate your federal resources to pursuing first? The brutal reality of this heavily scrutinized investigation is that the final chapter has not yet been written. The sprawling case remains actively open, suspended in a terrifying state of high alert. The federal task force is currently operating under immense, crushing pressure, fighting a desperate war against a biological clock that they cannot control. The most agonizing aspect of this ongoing crisis is the undeniable medical vulnerability of the missing woman. Without direct access to her essential cardiac hardware monitoring and her strictly regulated daily pharmaceuticals, her physical survival window shrinks exponentially with every passing hour. This is not a situation where investigators have the luxury of time to slowly build a circumstantial case. They are racing against a silent internal countdown. The entire weight of the massive manhunt currently rests on two highly specific, fragile pillars of physical evidence. The first is the microscopic world hidden within the fabric of the discarded dark hand covering found in the dirt near the crime scene. Nancy lived a quiet, meticulously routine-driven, and highly insulated existence in Arizona. Forensic geneticists are working around the clock, deploying advanced vacuum extraction techniques, hoping beyond hope to isolate a single viable strand of suspect biological material that can be definitively matched to an existing federal offender profile. The second pillar is the painstaking, incredibly tedious process of tracing the proprietary dark utility bag seen strapped to the suspect on the grainy video. Analysts are currently pulling massive volumes of point-of-sale data from countless retail locations across the entire region, desperately trying to find a single cash transaction, a fleeting glimpse on a store camera, or any digital breadcrumb that connects a faceless buyer to that specific piece of mass-produced nylon equipment. But until those highly technical forensic avenues yield a concrete result, the authorities are left staring into a terrifying void of information. They know exactly how the violent ambush was executed. They understand the chilling psychological discipline required to maintain a pristine indoor environment while committing a bloody act outside, and they have three highly distinct behavioral profiles to pursue. Yet, the most critical question remains agonizingly unanswered. Her daily life was not defined by flashing television cameras or urgent breaking news alerts. Where did the Phantom take his incredibly fragile, highly valuable captive after he vanished from the digital sightline of the residential cameras? The immaculate condition of the living room will forever stand as a silent, haunting testament to the terrifying efficiency of the unknown predator. It represents the ultimate investigative nightmare, a scene that offers absolutely no narrative clues about the final destination. The detectives are left sifting through alleged extortion letters and chasing retail supply chains, all while a family endures the unimaginable psychological torture of simply not knowing. The desperation of the massive search grid is palpable. Tactical helicopters continuously scan the vast, empty desert surrounding the upscale neighborhood. High-powered thermal imaging cameras frantically search for any sign of a hidden encampment or a concealed vehicle. The vastness of the southwestern landscape works entirely in favor of a suspect who meticulously planned their escape route long before the sun ever went down. Every abandoned property, every remote storage facility, and every isolated canyon is a potential holding location that must be systematically cleared by heavily armed units. The sheer geographical scale of the required search grid is completely overwhelming, but rather by the strict, unforgiving, and relentless schedule of her failing health, forcing the command center to prioritize leads based on microscopic probabilities rather than solid, undeniable facts. This is the excruciating reality of an open, targeted abduction case. It is a relentless, exhausting grind of ruling out dead ends while praying that the laboratory technicians find the single biological key capable of unlocking the entire mystery before the physical resilience of the captive completely expires. The quiet suburban neighborhood has returned to its normal deceptive stillness, but the heavy shadow of the unresolved abduction lingers over every locked door and every darkened driveway. The case remains a chilling reminder that ultimate security is largely an illusion, and that true monsters do not always break down the front door. Sometimes they wait patiently in the cold darkness, executing their plans with a quiet, terrifying perfection that leaves nothing behind but blood on the concrete and a deafening, unanswerable silence. When we analyze the architectural structure of this specific investigation, two vital educational principles emerge regarding criminal behavior and systemic vulnerability. They brace themselves for the chaos that almost always follows. Nancy relied heavily on a surgically implanted cardiac pacemaker just to keep her heart beating steadily through the night. The first is the critical forensic distinction between an authentic crime scene and a staged environment. Behavioral science teaches us that what is completely absent from a location is often far more revealing than what is left behind. A chaotic, disorganized environment suggests emotional panic and a complete lack of premeditation. Conversely, a perfectly undisturbed interior located immediately adjacent to a site of extreme physical violence indicates supreme cognitive control. The suspect intentionally compartmentalized the violence, recognizing that entering the residence would unnecessarily multiply their forensic risk profile and completely jeopardize the primary objective. The second, broader lesson concerns the complex sociology of modern notoriety. What this case teaches us about vulnerability is that extreme public visibility creates a dangerous, cascading risk matrix. When an individual achieves massive national prominence, their entire extended network is inadvertently transformed into a potential target surface. Criminal syndicates or ideologically motivated actors often recognize that the most effective way to exert immense psychological pressure or extract massive financial concessions from a heavily guarded public figure is not to attack them directly. She also required a very specific, carefully timed, and absolute regimen of daily prescription medications, simply to maintain her baseline physical stability, but rather to exploit the quiet, isolated, and physically vulnerable members of their immediate family. Fame does not provide an impenetrable shield. It frequently acts as a powerful, unavoidable beacon, illuminating the quietest corners of a family tree. For predators who possess the patience to map out the weakest, most easily accessible branches. Understanding this specific dynamic is absolutely crucial for modern security architecture. It demands a fundamental shift from simply protecting the high-profile asset to securing the entire sprawling web of their personal relationships against highly organized, deeply asymmetrical threats. The final, enduring image of this ongoing crisis is the grainy silhouette of a heavily armed phantom calmly stepping out of the infrared glow and completely vanishing into the vast desert night. When a violent predator leaves a meticulously clean home behind, it is absolutely not a stroke of logistical luck. It is a bold, calculated declaration of absolute control from an educated hunter who is currently still breathing the free air somewhere out there in the dark. She was, by all medical definitions, an elderly woman who desperately needed profound peace, absolute predictability, and the protective, unwavering safety of her heavily secured suburban environment. The pursuit of absolute truth in these shattered lives demands our unwavering attention. We must continue to shine a bright light into these incredibly dark spaces until every single question is finally answered and justice is unequivocally served. Next week, we will aggressively tear open a completely different physical archive, exploring a deeply unsettling scenario where an arrogant killer confidently left his biological signature at the site of a brutal attack, yet the American judicial system still required 2 agonizing decades to finally speak his true name out loud. Make sure you hit the subscribe button and immediately activate your notifications so you never miss a single crucial detail. I am your host, Seth, and you are officially locked into the permanent archives of crime stories. The immense wealth and the towering public profile associated with her immediate family did not make her physically stronger, nor did it make her any more capable of defending herself against a sudden, violent threat. Instead, that extremely high-profile status inadvertently transformed her quiet, unassuming solitude into a massive, glaring liability. Every single day of her life was a delicate, careful balance of strict medical necessity and geographical familial distance. Predators who specifically target the elderly demographic rarely ever look for a fair physical fight. They actively look for isolation, they actively look for profound physical weakness, and most importantly, they look for a rigid daily routine that they can easily map, perfectly predict, and ultimately exploit with ruthless precision. They expect to find overturned furniture, shattered glass, and the frantic, messy destruction characteristic of a home invasion or a burglary gone horribly wrong. On the cool evening of January 31st, 2026, that exact routine was playing out exactly as it always had for years. Nancy had spent the early evening enjoying a peaceful, quiet dinner with her other daughter Annie and her son-in-law Tommaso Cioni. It was a completely normal, unremarkable family gathering, entirely devoid of any known tension, arguments, or explicit threats of danger. As the pleasant night slowly wound down, Tommaso personally drove Nancy back to her sprawling home in the Catalina foothills. The car slowly pulled into the long driveway, the bright headlights briefly sweeping across the quiet, meticulously manicured landscaping. At exactly 9:50 p.m., Tommaso meticulously made sure Nancy was safely inside her secure residence. He watched her slowly cross the threshold, exchanging a warm, final good night before turning back and returning to his waiting vehicle. To anyone casually observing the quiet neighborhood that night, it was simply an attentive relative, ensuring an elderly mother safely made it home, secure and sound. Nancy locked her heavy doors, slowly preparing to begin her rigid nightly medical routine and settle down for a long sleep. She was completely surrounded by the familiar, quiet comforts of her own personal sanctuary, entirely unaware that her perfectly predictable schedule, but what greeted local law enforcement at a quiet, upscale residence in the Catalina foothills of Arizona, defied every standard criminal profile they had ever been taught. Her undeniable physical frailty and her famous family name had already been carefully factored into a cold, clinical, and devastatingly precise equation. The bright headlights of the car of Tommaso slowly faded down the dark, quiet suburban street, finally leaving the fragile 84-year-old woman completely alone in the sprawling, intensely silent house. The heavy front door remained securely locked from the inside, standing as the very last physical barrier between her quiet life and the deep, actively watching darkness of the cold Arizona night. Morning routines are often the most deeply ingrained habits in the life of an elderly person, serving as the steady, reliable anchor for their entire day. When those deeply entrenched patterns are suddenly and inexplicably broken, the silence that follows is usually the very first blaring alarm of a crisis. On the brisk Sunday morning of February 1st, 2026, the digital community at the local Church of Nancy gathered for their regular online broadcast. Nancy was a devoted, remarkably consistent attendee of these specific virtual services. Logging in from the quiet safety of her living room was an absolute non-negotiable pillar of her weekend schedule. The interior of the sprawling home was completely immaculate. However, as the familiar opening hymns began to play through the speakers of dozens of congregants, the digital profile of Nancy remained entirely absent from the screen. She simply did not log into the service. At 84 years old, with a highly dependent cardiac pacemaker and a strict daily medication schedule, even a minor deviation in her morning routine was cause for immediate paralyzing concern. The absence was quickly noted by her family. Annie and Tommaso, the very last people to see her safely secured inside her home the previous night, felt an immediate, icy spike of dread. They quickly drove back to the Catalina Foothills property, praying that it was simply a technical glitch, a forgotten password, or perhaps just a heavy morning sleep. But as they approached the sprawling exterior of the quiet suburban house, the creeping sense of profound unease rapidly escalated into absolute, undeniable terror. The exterior of the home felt wrong. When they frantically rushed to check the perimeter, their worst possible fears materialized in the most violent way imaginable. The heavy back door of the residence, a door that should have been securely deadbolted from the inside, not a single throw pillow was out of place on the couch. The floors were spotless and entirely undisturbed, was completely wide open, exposing the interior to the cold morning air. And there, stark and horrifying against the concrete of the back patio, were distinct, undeniable smears of dark red blood. It was a visual confirmation of sheer violence. Panic immediately took over, and a desperate call was made to local law enforcement. Deputies from the Pima County Sheriff Department rapidly descended upon the quiet neighborhood, their sirens shattering the Sunday morning stillness. As the first responding officers drew their weapons and carefully stepped onto the bloody patio, their adrenaline surged. They were mentally preparing to clear a chaotic, violently disturbed crime scene, anticipating the scattered wreckage of a brutal home invasion. They stepped through the wide open back door, carefully sweeping their flashlights across the darkened interior spaces, bracing themselves for the absolute worst. But as their eyes adjusted to the lighting inside the home, the surging adrenaline abruptly morphed into a profound, chilling confusion. The interior of the house was completely, utterly immaculate. Absolutely nothing of value had been touched, let alone taken from the property. The polished floors showed absolutely no signs of a desperate struggle. The heavy wooden furniture remained perfectly aligned in its usual elegant arrangement. There were no hastily overturned chairs, no violently shattered picture frames, and absolutely no ransacked drawers. The pristine, unbothered stillness of the living room stood in terrifying, absurd contrast to the bloody, chaotic violence documented just inches away on the concrete patio outside. The seasoned investigators slowly lowered their weapons, realizing instantly that the narrative they had mentally constructed in the patrol car was entirely wrong. They were not looking at the frantic, disorganized aftermath of a common burglar who had simply panicked upon discovering an elderly resident. The complete absence of any internal property damage or theft told a much colder, far more deliberate story. Someone had aggressively breached the perimeter of the property, violently engaged the 84-year-old woman outside or right at the threshold, and successfully removed her from the premises without ever needing to tear through her belongings. As the reality of the immaculate, silent living room set in, the lead investigators understood the terrifying truth. The house was frozen in a pristine, eerie silence that directly contradicted the violent, undeniable evidence left on the driveway and the back patio. They were not hunting a thief who had accidentally stumbled into a kidnapping. They were hunting a highly organized, heavily prepared predator who had arrived at the Catalina Foothills property with one single terrifying objective. The intruder did not want the physical possessions or the hidden valuables of Nancy Guthrie. The intruder only wanted Nancy herself. When physical evidence at a crime scene deeply contradicts common sense, investigators must immediately turn to the silent, digital eyes that never sleep. In affluent, highly secured suburban neighborhoods, exactly like the Catalina Foothills, security cameras are nearly ubiquitous, recording the darkest hours of the night with unblinking precision. The assigned detectives frantically pulled the encrypted digital storage drives from the surrounding residential security infrastructure, desperately hoping a hidden lens had somehow captured the violent phantom who had vanished into the cold Arizona air. They sat in the darkened command center, meticulously scrubbing through the grainy, time-stamped footage from the early morning hours of February 1st. They watched hours of absolute stillness, anxiously waiting for any subtle movement in the deep shadows. And then, at the exact time the violent abduction was heavily alleged to have taken place, the digital silence was abruptly broken.